So in this chapter, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to do the second and third types of macroeconomic statistics. In the previous chapter, we looked at how GDP is calculated, or overall production. And so then what we're looking at here is unemployment and inflation. So then we'd be looking at employment levels and price levels. So this would complete our discussion then of the three macroeconomic statistics, and then we'll add on to that the cyclical nature in which the economy performs, where economies rise to peaks and then fall later. Let's start with the business cycle first, since it's a pretty easy concept here, is that economic activity basically increases and decreases in a cyclical fashion following these steps. The peak, which would be your highest point, the recession kind of being your path downwards, to your trough, which is your lowest point, to expansion, which is your path upwards. Now, why this happens, there's lots of reasons, there's lots of theories about why this happens, but there is no clear-cut reason about why this happens. There was a lot of research done on it after the Great Depression, because that was such a bad recession, right? That was a depression. And there's a group, in fact, called the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's not related to the government here. The NBER is a private organization that actually is in charge with its business cycle dating committee to set the dates when all of these things are said to occur. And if we look at that graphically, we shouldn't be too surprised here. If this is our level of time and this is our level of real output, or seen another way, real GDP. Instead of seeing it as a straight line, right, we could really think of it like a wave function. And in that wave function, we could take a standardized line, right? We could kind of run the averages here. And you would see the following. Where this is my peak. There's my trough. Moving up. That's my expansion period. And going down, that's my recession period. When we're trying to manage the economy, then we're kind of trying to keep us at the peak and in expansionary periods longer. And in managing the economy, we're trying to keep the recessions and the troughs smaller. And that's going to be the point of the next chapter when we talk about the two kinds of ways that we manage the economy. The first way through fiscal policy and the latter way through monetary policy. And in terms of managing the economy, through fiscal policy and monetary policy, which basically means either the government is doing something or the central bank does it. These two actors, the government and the central bank, then are have as a primary task trying to make economies grow longer and not decline as much. And what you see here with this kind of notable exception here is that you see recent progress in achieving that, where the average recession lasts less than a year. And that the 1960s or early 1970s are a bit more problematic, but that the recessions in certainly in our generation, myself included, we've had up until most recently, we had a pretty stable economy. I mean, if you look at that from 1982 then to 2007, only 2 recessionary periods, and both of those a very short time. So the severity of this recession then is a reflection of the fact that we had expansions for such a long time. And then even then, the depth of the recession, yes, it's quite severe, yet it rivals that of recessions earlier. So as I said, why are there recessions is a bit of a complicated question, because there are so many reasons why that's the case. Business cycles, like how we change from an expansion to a contraction or from a peak to a trough, can happen for multiple reasons. One kind of motivation for it can be the demand shock. That would mean that something suddenly happens that changes the demand for products by consumers. It could be something as simple as, a war all of a sudden happens, right? Well, then people are going to become fearful and they're going to stop buying stuff. Or a terrorist event happens, right? Then people might get scared again and things happen. Or, alternatively, people might become abnormally exuberant about something, right? Stock markets are going up and then all of a sudden people feel richer and then they start buying much more stuff. On the supply side, we can also see these kind of shocks. And what we mean by shocks are sudden, unexpected events that suddenly happen. And when we're talking about it in terms of supply, what we're talking about here is that, let's say there's a court ruling all of a sudden that changes how something is taxed or how revenue is captured, or that a new technology starts to take hold and that changes the way that firms produce goods. Also, another kind of persistence perhaps of a business cycle could be that prices are sticky. And what we mean by sticky is that prices are a bit inflexible in the downward direction. Prices generally are able to go up pretty quickly, but they're not able to go down quickly. And because they don't go down quickly, that can cause a business cycle to change, because prices are critical to, if prices are falling, people buy more stuff, firms make less, and vice versa. And if prices are sticky in the downward direction, that can change consumer demand in a way that's unexpected. Also, as the economy is changing, we would expect generally changes in output and employment. So in other words, if the economy is expanding and there's much more demand, then firms should increase their output and increase their employment. But they might not, right? They might have some other way to increase production without increasing employment, and vice versa. Perhaps a firm finds that they are unable to reduce their output or face restrictions, let's say because of a union, in reducing their number of employees. And so if they can't do these things, then they also would have some resistance to having a business cycle changing. Because there is a business cycle, the thing that's most affected by business in the fact that economic performance moves in a cycle is first capital goods, that you generally only make significant investments if you're feeling optimistic. And why would you feel optimistic? Because the economy is at a peak, right? And in an expansionary period, and you think things are going to go great. If you're in a recession or in a trough, you're not going to be very optimistic and willing to invest in capital goods. Same goes for consumer durables. These are expensive, long-lasting products. Let's say like a refrigerator, right? A refrigerator is supposed to last 10, 15 years. If you think you're going to lose your job, you probably aren't going to go out and replace your refrigerator unless it absolutely needs to be replaced. Things that are affected less by the fact that the economic performance moves in a cycle are services. Services are, consumers are generally resistant to reducing their demand for them because they're generally absolutely essential. We're talking about things like education, even healthcare to some extent. These are services that might not change very much based on the performance of the economy. And then other essentials to living, food and clothing, right? I'm not going to start to walk around naked because the economy is in a recession and I don't think I can afford clothes. I've already talked about all of these. I guess I'll just talk about them a little bit more just for kind of further clarity here. What is it that causes a shock? Again, the shock is the unexpected change. Well, the innovation can occur with irregularity. That means that, I don't know, I'm sure that there's some technology out there that you and I can't even envision will exist 5 years from now. Or think about the fact that social networks like Facebook, like, Facebook's a prime one. Those things haven't existed for more than a decade. And before they existed, things like that didn't exist. So all of a sudden they existed. And it has changed fundamentally the way that consumers communicate with each other. It's changed the way that firms communicate with consumers and that consumers communicate with firms. That's an irregular innovation. Or the internet, right? Before the internet and connectivity existed within firms perhaps did commerce the old-fashioned way. But then all of a sudden it changed quite quickly in the late 90s, early 2000s. We could have changes in productivity that are unexpectedly occurring because perhaps there's a new technology or a disease all of a sudden happens, something that changes there. A shock can also be a monetary factor. That would mean that there's an unexpected change in the money supply, which leads to changes in the interest rate. So if the money supply changes unexpectedly, that'll change the interest rate, and as it changes the interest rate, then people buy things with different regularity. There could be political events that are unexpected, right? What if, right, a president gets impeached, right? That would cause an unexpected change in who the president is. It might cause an unexpected change in policies. There could also be instability in the financial system. Well, that would be kind of linked to this, right? That if all of a sudden we don't know if homeowners are going to pay back their loans, that's an unexpected change from the past where people paying off their mortgages was a pretty expected thing. So all those things cause business cycles to exist. Just to kind of talk about unemployment a little bit further here before we kind of go into this kind of discussion right here. I just want to make sure that I have enough time to do this. I want to talk about this slide in a slightly different way that gets you a better handle on the idea of who is unemployed versus who is not. So here's what I want you to picture here. I want you to picture that in a country, we start out with the total population. And from that total population, what we then do is break it down into two categories. One category being those who are basically adults, at least in the working world. They're not in the hospital, they're not in prison, meaning that they are basically physically and legally able to be, I guess we should also add, not in the military as well, that they're physically and legally capable of working. Then we have basically our other category then being kids, military, and hospital patients. Then within this category, I also have two categories, with those two categories being not in labor force, and then here my civilian labor force. Civilian meaning not in the military. And then that breaks down to employed and unemployed. And as I draw this out, what I want you to be aware of is that there is a distinct difference between this box and this box. What does it mean to be not in the labor force? It can mean that you are rich. It can mean that you are lazy. It can mean that you are a student. It can mean that you are incredibly discouraged and don't even look for work. It means you're a discouraged worker. Because to be unemployed, you have to be you have to fulfill basically three conditions. That you're both physically and legally capable of working. Now we know that because they're in this category here. That they are not working. But so far with those two categories right there, they are no different than this category right here. Because not in the labor force also means that you are physically and legally capable of working and that you're not working. But then there's one additional thing. And that is you have to be looking for work. The discouraged worker is so pessimistic about the economy that they have stopped looking. And what you see is in a severe recession that people stop looking and that they move to this category. And then as the economy starts to do better, they start to look again. With that understanding, let's then look at what it means to be unemployed. In terms of this picture here, it means that the unemployment rate is equal to number of unemployed over the civilian labor force. And that's that ratio times 100. And that's exactly what you see here. Oh, I guess not under 15, under 16. Sorry. Let's use these numbers here. Why not? Okay, so here's what I'm doing here. From this slide here, slide 11-8, I'm taking all these numbers and I'm just putting them into this right here. So we have 308.7 million here, 70.9 million right here. I mean, I suppose we could add to this here. Let me get out my calculator here. So what I did here is just 308.7 minus 70.9 to get 237.8. And then here I would have 237.8 minus the 153.9 to get 83.9. Which would mean that the unemployment rate in this case here would be equal to 14.8 over 153.9 times 100 to get me a rate of 9.61663418%. I'm not going to round here just for whatever reason. That's exactly what you're seeing here. Now, what else does it mean to be unemployed? That we basically have three ways in which people are unemployed. And these first two are part of a larger category known as natural unemployment. And that would be the unemployment essentially, the natural unemployment would be the unemployment when my economy is performing at a long-run average or doing pretty darn well. that we would see some unemployment naturally existing in any economy. Or put it another way, that even if the economy is doing very well, economists don't expect the unemployment rate to be zero. Rather, we expect there to be some frictional unemployment. It is always the case that there's at least someone in the economy that is between jobs. Let's say I quit my job with an employer and then I say, I'm not going to, I'm going to look for work, but I'm not going to take my new employment for 2 more weeks because I want to take that epic vacation I've been waiting to take, or I just want to sleep in and watch episodes of Law and Order. Right, whatever your reason is, we might think that some people are going to take a little bit longer to find work than they want to because they're just kind of resting up and being just naturally lazy like any human being would be. So that's the natural frictions that exist in a market. And that we would also see some people unemployed because the structure of the economy is changing. And because the structure of the economy is changing, people then find that they have to be re-educated how to work in that new labor force. And that takes time. Right? So, for instance, if I was a classic professor and all I could do was lecture but I didn't know how to teach online, maybe I'd get fired and say, to find that new job of teaching at a online university, it might take me 6 months or a year to find out how to use YouTube or whatever. Okay, well now I'm going to be structurally unemployed for that period of time. And then there's kind of what your instincts tell you, which is that the employment level should change as well, depending on where we are in the business cycle. That the actual unemployment then is equal to the natural unemployment plus the cyclical unemployment, where the natural is the frictional and the structural. And these all add up to be the actual unemployment, or what you measured. In the case of the United States, the natural unemployment rate is found to be approximately 5%. That in a normal performing United States economy, the natural rate of unemployment should be about 5%. Right now, we're less than that. That would mean that we have some negative cyclical unemployment. What is that telling you? That's telling you that people who are not typically working are able to find jobs. This would be like, people with like a criminal record, right? Like as long as the criminal record isn't that bad, maybe they could now get employed in this kind of economy. In the case of Hawaii specifically, the unemployment rate in Hawaii is anywhere between 3 to 4% right now, which would mean that, right, the biggest source of employment growth here in Hawaii is construction. That might mean that construction companies are hiring workers that they typically wouldn't hire. And so we see some negative cyclical unemployment, giving us an actual unemployment rate that's a little bit less than 5%. And this just kind of bullet points what I've just said. That full employment then is not when we're at 100% employment, but rather when we have an unemployment rate that's about 5%. And that reflects the output of that economy performing at its long-run average. Now, in terms of the cost of there being unemployment seen in economic terms, what we get is a GDP gap. And that GDP gap then is the difference. And that difference can be positive or negative, but it's the difference then between the actual GDP and the potential GDP. what could the production levels be if we were using all of our workers? That means that we have a 5% unemployment rate type of economy, the natural rate of unemployment rate kind of economy. Because what we're saying here is that, just kind of going back to the previous slide here, is that when we're at full employment, or about 5% natural unemployment, we are at our potential output. But if the economy is, for instance, in a recession, like for instance in 2007 to 2009, when at its peak we had a 10% unemployment rate, then the actual GDP was less than if we were at full potential. And then go the other way, what we're experiencing right now, and that would be that our GDP exceeds what we'd be at if we had 5% unemployment. Now, that loss and or gain of the income is unequal to individuals because, right, who are the kinds of individuals that lose their jobs first? Well, it'd be the less educated, those with criminal records, certain minorities, right? People who have childcare responsibilities. All these are the kind of individuals that can lose their jobs first or gain their jobs last if the economy is performing very well. They're the ones that suffer that loss of income or get a delayed amount of an increase in income from an economy that does well. If we look at these unemployment rates globally, what we see, now this is only going out to 2010 here. So the data is dated. But what we see here is that, contrary to popular belief, you see European countries at least where, especially in the case of Germany, which is the strongest European economy, where that was a flexible labor force to some extent, where the unemployment rate did go up just as much as it did in the U.S. But that perhaps a country like Japan, because of labor market restrictions and whatnot, because the unemployment rate didn't go up as much, that hurts the economy. Or if we look at the French economy, where labor unionization is rather strong, that can hurt the economy, because this can mean that firms aren't able to get rid of workers when they need to, and that would mean that they have higher costs. The third economic statistic is inflation, or basically changes in prices. And we see these changes in prices occurring for two reasons. Those two reasons being demand pull or cost push inflation. Prices go up because either people are buying lots of stuff, and so firms have to raise their price because people are buying so much stuff, or firms raise their prices because their costs are going up. The problem with inflation is that what it does is if I'm getting paid, let's say, and this is not my salary, so don't think that Scheiding makes this much. Let's say I'm getting paid $100,000 a year. Every year. And then I'm going to get paid that for the next 10 years. I'm going to be pretty grumpy about that, because what that's going to mean is that if inflation exists, that $100,000 isn't going to buy as much next year as it does this year, because my purchasing power will be reduced. Basically, what does my income buy? It buys less when there's inflation. How we calculate inflation is with the Consumer Price Index. Let's talk a little bit more about how a CPI is calculated. So what it does is it assumes that a fixed basket of goods exists. So consumers basically always buy the same stuff. Let's say that it's every month they buy 5 gallons of milk, 20 gallons of gas. Now let's make them a nerd. They buy 1 calculator every month, because there's always a new model out there. And that they buy, I don't know, I'm gonna make this pretty uninteresting here. 20 pounds of food, I don't know, whatever, right? Whatever it is. So the quantities are never changing. This is what consumers buy, and they buy that every month, month in and month out. But what we're saying is that the prices can change based on the year. I don't know, I'm just going to make my life easier. I just made up these numbers here. The total cost of the basket in year 1 would equal 5 gallons of milk times 1 plus 20 gallons of gas times 2 plus 1 calculator times 3 plus 20 pounds of food times 4. This is a multiply here. The basket in year 1 cost $128. Total cost in year 2, well, I already know what it's going to be because I basically just doubled everything. So let's just make my life a little easy here. It's going to equal $256. If you don't believe me, what you can do is take 5 times 2 plus 20 times 4 plus 1 times 6 plus 20 times 8. And you should get 256. And let's do for year 3. That would be equal to 5 times 3 plus 20 times 5 plus 1 times 7 plus 20 times 9. Which should basically be equal to 15 plus 100 plus 7 plus 180, 280, 295, 302. So now look at what this fixed basket of goods, look at how the price has changed over time. What I then need to do to calculate the CPI, let's kind of write it out this way. In terms of how you find the CPI number, I basically calculate the cost of the basket of goods. Second, I I then take the cost of the basket in whatever year I'm looking at over the cost of the basket in the base year. Let's say that I am calculating it. Let's say that my base year, the base year is something that you would be told. Let's say that the base year is year 2. So let's say that I tell you that the base year is year 2. Then what that tells you is that for CPI for year 1 is equal to the price of the basket in year 1, which is 128, over the price of the basket in year 2, which is 256, times 100, which is a CPI number of 50. No labels, it's just 50. CPI in year 2 would be the cost of the basket in year 2, which is 256, over the cost of the basket in the base year, which is also 256, times 100, which is equal to 100. The CPI in the base year is always 100. I'll repeat that again. The CPI in the base year is always 100. And then the CPI in year 3 would be 302 over 256 times 100, giving me 117, 0.97. So now I have 3 CPI numbers. What we can then do is calculate the percentage difference in these CPI numbers to get an idea of what the inflation rate is. Where do I want to put this? I want to put this on this page here. Changes in prices are measured by the percentage difference in the CPI numbers. So basically, once you've done all these steps to calculate CPI numbers, I then just take the percentage difference between them to find out what the inflation rate is. What does that look like here? Wow, that's wrong. Again, I didn't make these slides here. Whoever made these slides is not going to pass this class. It's not the equation for CPI. That would be your equation for percentage change, which would be your latest year, let's call it new, minus old, your earlier year, over the older CPI number. So let's say this was like your, I don't know, your 2016 CPI number. And let's say that this was your 2015 CPI number. So it'd be your 2016 CPI number minus your 2015 CPI number minus your over your 2015 CPI number, and what you'd see is a 1.6% difference. Sorry for that mistake. Some level I can be blamed for it by not having made my own slides, but rather spending the time doing this narration instead. It's just an error. I shouldn't be too hard on them. I probably make enough errors on the other side for them to admonish me. What do inflation levels look like around the world? Well, they actually move pretty much in lockstep. They move very close to one another, with the exception of Japan, which actually has a very different and much more difficult problem. Look at that. It's actually below zero, meaning that prices are actually falling. Japan has what's known as deflation. That's a very, very bad thing to have. The US only has had it twice in the past 120 years probably. Has only had two brief periods of deflation. One during the Great Depression and then during the depths of it in 1933, and then most recently in 2009. Like, that's how you know that this most past recession that we went through was as bad as it was, because we actually had deflation. The reason why it's bad to have prices going in the downward direction is because the economy is very inflexible in the downward direction. Prices can go up and then my employer can raise my wages, for instance. But if prices are going down, my employer is generally unable to lower my wages, right? Because then I, as a worker, I'm going to get very grumpy. And so if you can't lower wages, because we don't have a lot of mechanisms for lowering wages, then if prices can't be flexible, then you lack a way to deal with the prices going down. And you see this right here, right? That very brief period where the prices actually were falling. In our lifetime, we have had generally lower inflation. Even if we go back to the year I was born in the year 1977. In fact, my birthday is on Sunday, June 5th. I share my birthday with Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes, and then me. Three great economists who are Geminis and all born on June 5th. I don't know why I'm saying all that. I just consider it shameless. Send me a birthday present. I point this out because I just can remember this story of my parents talking about a mortgage they got in 1979. And when you look at that, 1979, I think they told me they got a mortgage at 16%. To put that in perspective, the mortgage rate right now for a 30-year fixed-term mortgage is, I think, in the 3 to 4% range. Different era. When prices could go up like 13, 14% a year, that would be unheard of for us today. That we generally expect prices to change, but not very much. Well, there we go, I guess. Finally, they decided to tell you what causes inflation. I already explained it. I guess I'll just repeat what I've said. And that would be that there's two reasons why prices generally then are going up. Either people are buying more stuff, or firms are facing higher costs. And the only way to deal with that then is by raising the price, either because everyone's buying stuff and now you have to sort out that scarcity, or firms are paying higher costs, so firms still need to maintain their profitability. What causes consumers to buy too much? That would happen if the central bank issues too much money. That's the concern right now. Right now in the United States, the general concern among economists is that the Federal Reserve printed too much cash, and it should, theoretically, it should have caused much more inflation than actually exists. And so economists are kind of confused about why inflation has not gone up higher than it has. And then the other side of this would be generally, why would firms start to experience higher costs? Generally because of supply shock. labor cost unexpectedly higher or something along those lines. The problem generally then with inflation is this idea that inflation can cause a redistribution of income. And it can cause that redistribution of income based on whether we anticipate the inflation or not. What does that mean? If inflation is entirely anticipated, then I can make labor contracts. I can make loans based on that expectation. That's an example right there. So I am obviously as a faculty member of UH, we are on a 2-year labor contract with the state, part of a union. And in that labor union contract, we have negotiated a 4% increase in our wages for these 2 years of our contract. That was made based on an anticipated rate of inflation. What if now something unexpected had happened? What if instead inflation was 50%? Then it would have been unexpectedly higher, and my wages only going up by 4% would have been pretty bad. Same with loans, right? If I make a loan now with the bank for the next 30 years for a mortgage at a 3% interest rate, and then something suddenly happens that changes the interest rate significantly, the bank is now going to get paid back in less valuable money because of that inflation. So what does that do? Well, when inflation exists, the one thing that it does is it hurts those who received fixed income. For instance, let's say that I get injured on the job. And I get injured on the job so much that I cannot work again. And that I get an insurance settlement and I'm going to get paid $50,000 a year for the rest of my life. That might seem pretty sweet right now, but 20 years from now, $50,000 isn't going to buy as much because of inflation. So now, that would be one person who's hurt by inflation. Those who received a fixed income that does not adjust by inflation because their real income is falling. Savers are also hurt by inflation because they save money that now buys less. The purchasing power is falling. And then those who lend money can also be hurt by inflation because lenders can get paid back unexpectedly in cheaper dollars. This is especially the case if the inflation is unanticipated. Because if it's anticipated, all they'll do is just raise the interest rate. But if it's unexpectedly higher, they're going to get hurt because it's going to be, they're going to have less. Now, there are others who are unaffected by inflation. Those who receive what's called a cost of living adjustment. Right? So what would be better is if that insurance settlement says I get paid $50,000 a year plus the published inflation rate. Because then what that would mean is that every year I'm going to have $50,000 in purchasing power. It's not going to be $50,000, but my $50,000 will go up by exactly the inflation rate. Social Security recipients actually do get this as well. So Social Security is not that Social Security recipients, which are basically old people, they get a fixed monthly income, but that fixed monthly income adjusts by exactly the inflation rate every year. More recently, over the past 2 years, because inflation has been so low, Social Security has not issued a cost of living adjustment. And so old people get really mad and they say Social Security isn't giving us any more money. But technically they shouldn't, because there has been basically no inflation. I'm not really sure why they put this. Yes, okay, so admittedly I am a member of a union. I am not using this as my platform to defend being in a union. My union, as far as I understand it, does not change my income by the inflation rate. We've agreed to 4%. I am just as likely to be hurt by that to benefit from it, because it's just 4% regardless of what the inflation rate is. So I'm just going to add here a clause. They could be unaffected by inflation if the union successfully said, we'll just increase your salary by the inflation rate. At least in the case of me as a state of Hawaii employee, it doesn't. So I don't know. I guess I bear some of the risk, but the state bears some of the risk as well. Those who borrow money also have the potential to be unaffected by inflation. They might actually unexpectedly benefit from inflation if they're able to pay back, right? It would be great if all of a sudden there was 50% inflation, because that would mean then that it would be easier for you to pay back your student loans, right? Because if you borrowed $10,000 for your college education, well, $10,000 is going to be easier to get if there's 50% inflation, because your wages are going to go up by quite a bit. And I've already talked about this here. But the idea would be there are two components to the interest rate. That the interest rate, which is nominal, or basically, what do I see, right, when I sign the loan document? What's the rate that I see? Let's say that I take out a car loan at 5%. That what that equals is the real rate plus inflation. Let's say that inflation is 2%. The real interest rate is kind of the cost of doing business, right? The fact that some people might default on their loan, that they have to market to people to find people who want to borrow money. You get to keep that pen when you sign the loan document. All of that is part of the cost of doing business. Then you need to make sure that they account for the fact that when you pay it back, you're paying back with 2% less valuable money to make that then for the 5%. I guess they just do that here. I don't know if that needed a whole slide, but that's what it did. But let's add to it the fact that that is all anticipated. If there's unanticipated inflation and the actual inflation was, let's say, 10%, which basically means if they only charged me 11%, then the real interest rate would have only been 1%, which wouldn't have been enough for them to conduct their costs of doing business. And this lender is likely to go out of business because they ran out of money. In terms of then, does the inflation levels, do they affect employment? Well, there's basically two kinds of theories to this. The one would be related to the cost push inflation, that yes, the inflation actually does reduce the real output. That as prices go up, firms just to not produce as much because they don't think that maybe they can raise their prices as much as they can. And seen another way from the demand pull inflation, it might actually be the case that some mild inflation is actually a good thing, because if prices are slightly going up over time, what that does is it makes sure that people don't buy too much stuff all at once and cause scarcity conditions. And then you can also have cases where there is hyperinflation. Hyperinflation's when the inflation rate becomes incredibly high. If you're curious about this kind of thing, well, this is the classic case of Zimbabwe, which had a 14.9 billion% inflation rate in 2008. Basically, it crushed the economy until they finally just took on the US dollar because no one wanted their currency. The country that's experiencing it right now, I'm totally misspelling that country's name, Venezuela. Businesses are getting out of Venezuela because the inflation rate is quite high in that country. Hyperinflation is basically a sign that the economy is about to collapse.